Good morning. Welcome to this webinar. We're just going to give people a few moments to join the call. But thank you all for logging on and joining us today as we work through this webinar for you. But if we just hang on for just a few moments as everybody joins the session. Thank you. Hi, Claudia. I can see you've joined the session there. It's great to see you online. We've got a few people scheduled to join that have not yet joined it, so we're just going to give a few more moments just to allow those the time to log in before we start the webinar today. See, the numbers are starting to level off now, so perhaps we can get things started today. So thank you everyone for joining this webinar in collaboration with OHSU and Scendea. I'd like to just take a few moments to thank everyone who's been part of this process in bringing this webinar together and tell you just a little bit about who we are here at Scendea and OHSU as well. So the Oregon Clinical and Translational Research Institute within OHSU is a catalyst for scientific collaboration, innovation and growth in Oregon and beyond. Oaktree works to help investigators, helps investigators, regional partners, and members of the study teams remove barriers, apply best practice, and translate biomedical advances into prevention and treatment. Programs such as BIP Corp and their series of educational webinars, such as this one, provide timely, targeted insights for innovators and entrepreneurs working to commercialize important medical advances and to improve human health. So thank you so much for the opportunity from OHSU for this webinar. So Scendea, we are a product development and regulatory consulting group. We're a global group with offices based in the UK, the US, the Netherlands, and in Australia. A team of 60 professionals globally, and we support our clients with CMC, clinical and non-clinical drug development and regulatory interactions. So we can help you with all of your product development and regulatory consulting requirements. On the call today, we have some of our experts here at Scendea. We have Younes and Cafaro. Thank you both for joining the call today. In just a few moments, I'll ask Dan and Zeb to introduce themselves, but for the benefit of the schedule, today we're going to be covering a few topics when interacting with the FDA and when best to interact with the FDA. So, topics we'll cover: the importance of having a plan and a regulatory strategy. When should I approach the FDA? What are the options, i.e. the meeting types the FDA offer? What response should I expect from the FDA? What is required from the data package when preparing and submitting an FDA IND request? What are the typical flags identified during due diligence gap analysis activities for programs in early development? And then we'll round off the session with a Q&A session itself. May I ask, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to put them in the Q&A chat box, and we will address those, or as many of those as we possibly can. For those that we don't get around to, we'll try and follow up and get answers to all of those questions after the session. So Dan, Zeb, it'd be great to hand over to you for a brief introduction from you both. Please introduce us. Zeb, perhaps you'd like to kick us off.
Thank you, Stu. We can go to the next slide. So hi, everyone. My name's Younes, and I'm the head of our development and consulting team here at Scendea. My background's over 20 years in the pharmaceutical and biotech industries. I've worked with both pharma, biotech, but tissue, cell, and gene therapies and vaccines as well. I've set up GMP laboratories and managed those operations, and I regularly support our clients getting into clinic and through all the way to approval, including my focus is actually the CMC support. So it's really getting the CMC activities through to the end. And that includes lots of reg activities, such as leading the company side of FDA pre-approval inspections and the routine EU GMP inspections. As a principal consultant, I regularly interact with the FDA and other regulators, such as the EMA, for a range of programs. And I would say we must meet with or have an interaction with the FDA at least 2 or 3 times a month. We work with some wonderfully innovative teams, but more and more, we are all pressed for time and budget. So we often find ourselves going to the agencies for feedback on some new approaches, or we're using scientific rationale to try and justify some abbreviated but scientifically based stances. And honestly speaking, we do get pushback on some of those, but we are finding that the agencies are more and more pragmatic and open to some of these, especially the experiences that we had during the pandemic. We're not seeing that level of flexibility, but we are certainly getting a lot more buy-in to some of these arguments. And I look forward to talking to you all today with my colleague, Dan Cafaro. Dan?
Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Cafaro, and I'm a principal consultant at Scendea. And my role at Scendea is regulatory affairs and U.S. agent. My responsibilities include interactions with FDA. We work with the different clients to facilitate all types of interactions, not only with the U.S. companies, but also foreign companies for which they require representation in the U.S. My career has always been in regulatory affairs. I started the career in the early 80s at Allergan, a company doing ophthalmology development. Then I moved to the Bay Area, where I reside in the San Francisco Bay Area, and work in a monoclonal antibody development company in multiple activities in different type of disease states. My focus there was regulatory affairs, of course, and primarily clinical and quality, anything that had to do with compliance. And then I moved to another company. After 20 years, I moved to another company doing development of siRNA. And I stayed there until a couple of years when I joined Scendea as a consultant. So very happy to be here and to help facilitate and understand the different activities for interacting with FDA. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Zeb to start the discussions.
Okay, thank you, Dan. So we are going to be starting with a discussion on the importance of having a plan and a regulatory strategy. And in our next slide, we present an example roadmap of development of the development plan all the way through to approval by the FDA and some of the points of interaction. And I do emphasize this is only an example. There's always exceptions and they're always designed. Every plan is based on a case-by-case scenario. This is a good illustration of a typical drug development program. So if we look at the bar in the middle, we begin, let me see if I can bring an arrow up here. Don't know if you can see that. So we begin with a TPP, the target product profile. And we go into this in a little bit more detail in the following slides. Every development program should ideally have a TPP. But to be honest, we usually don't see one at the start, and it's something we help our teams and our drug developers work with to implement. This allows everyone involved in the program to focus, and it prevents scope creep. It's one of the most dangerous things in a drug development program, and it always eats up your budget. So if you know exactly what you're aiming for, then everybody's on the same page. So we start with a target product profile. This is what we update as we move. So although it's at the beginning of this chart, it's something that's a living document, and we update it as we move through development. And then we move into the preclinical phase. So this is where we conduct proof of concept studies and exploratory studies to get us into a position where we're collecting information and we're beginning to collect everything we need to enable us to file our IND, our investigational new drug dossier, that once filed will allow us to initiate our clinical program. A typical clinical program will include a phase 1 study. This is usually a small study, perhaps tens of people, in typically healthy volunteers, and it's usually a single site that's conducting this study. We then move through, and we may need to stage each of these clinical phases, but we then would move through to perhaps a phase 2 study. And now we would be not just looking at safety of our program, but we'll be trying to understand the level of dosing we need and understanding perhaps some efficacy readouts at this point. This is a larger study, perhaps hundreds of subjects, and perhaps they will even be patients in some cases. So we're now building our initial readout, building on our safety information, but getting a bit of efficacy and dosing understanding information. And then we'll move into our much larger study, our pivotal to our program study, our phase 3 study. This one will really prove that our product does what it says on the tin. It's safe and it works, and this is how we administer it in terms of label claim and dosage. So this is our phase 3 program. It's usually a multi-center program, could be a global one, and it could have thousands of patients that are enrolled in the program. Once we've completed our clinical development, we will then collect this data and move it forward to gain some approval. If we look above this bar, we have a number of interactions that we will have with the regulatory agencies to help us move forward in development. We could have an interact, and this is an initial targeted engagement for regulatory advice. So it's an interact meeting that we could have with the FDA. It's suitable for some innovative programs, especially early in development, where we haven't really developed our rationale for our clinical study designs, our toxicology or non-clinical study designs, and we want some early engagement. It's a great place to start for those kinds of programs. We would then, before we get into filing our IND, we will have usually a pre-IND interaction with the FDA. This is where we will go to see them. We've got some proof of concept data. We've got some good data packages supporting how our product works. We've got product. We're manufacturing some non-clinical material. We've got some interesting information on our process and our controls. And we've got a clinical study synopsis or some kind of design that we want to discuss with the agency. We'll have that discussion with them, and that will give us, it will help de-risk any issues coming up during our IND. So with that information, we take it on board when we get their feedback, and we will file an IND with the agency with all of this data in that. And that will, once filed, we'll have our clinical program ongoing, and we'll continue to file amendments to that IND as we move forward to provide more information to help us enable movement through the development phases. Typically, once we've completed our phase 2, we'll have an end of phase 2 meeting, and that will be to review where we are and also to help us plan ahead for our pivotal study to make sure everything fits where it needs to be. And then once we've generated all this data, we will start our pre-biological license application or pre-new drug application dossier meetings with the agency. And that in those discussions, we'll be making sure we have everything we need in readiness for our NDA and BLA. So we'll file those depending on the type of product we have, and that will be reviewed, and that would lead to our approval licensure of our product. At the bottom, we have some of the relevant initiatives that would be appropriate for different types of programs. We have here an orphan drug designation, which is initiative we can apply for even before we have clinical data. It can be applied for throughout the program, but it can be applied for early enough, depending on the convincing arguments we have. Once we have this, we'll qualify for a number of incentives for drug development. Then we could also apply, depending on the program, and these are all really specific, there's specific requirements to meet these designations. We can have fast track designation. Once in our phase 1 development program, we can also move into having breakthrough designation and RMAT, regenerative medicine advanced therapy designation, again, depending on the type of program. As we move forward, by the time of our phase 3, we want to have a pediatric study plan in place with the agency. So these are the documents and designations we need to work on and make sure they're in place as we move forward. These are some elements for the drug development process. And as I mentioned, this is only an example, but it's just to give you an idea of how the flow would move forward. So next, Stuart, we can move on to the next slide. So next here, I mentioned the target product profile. And some of you may already have these, which is great, but some of you may not. And usually, first place you go is you try and Google it. And if you Google target product profile, there'll be so many different types, and it can be quite baffling. So I will say that a TPP can actually be a really simple document. And when you begin in early development, it can even be a 1-2 page document. It's only later in development when you start filling it out and adding more and more, it ends up being quite a bulky document. But for the start, if you put the TPP together with some of the key areas that you want to focus on, it will help all of your stakeholders focus. So that includes people who are developing your process, your formulation, your clinical synopsis, CMOs, CROs, other parties that are involved, or third parties. It will really help them focus and make sure they don't get distracted. I'll give you some examples of that. We typically would have an introduction explaining the type of product. Is it a small molecule? Is it a tissue, cell, or gene therapy? Is it a vaccine? What's the type of molecule? What's the type of indication we're beginning to look at? We'll then specify the legal basis. This is a really useful piece that we add to our TPPs, because if we're clear what our legal basis is, it really helps us with the rest of our designs. For example, if we are filing under the legal basis that qualifies to be a biosimilar or a generic, this will give us some abbreviated routes we can take for the non-clinical and clinical options that we couldn't take for others. But it will mean we'll have to have a much more comprehensive quality CMC section if we're applying for a new drug legal basis. This will help us focus our development and know that we have to have a standalone package. This is where the legal basis is useful. And then we go into our target product profile, really the core of it. This is the TPP, and it can be as simple as a table like this, where we've got some product properties, we've got a minimum acceptable result. So this is usually defined in collaboration with the subject matter experts, but also with some of your stakeholders, which may include business development team members who are concerned about cost of goods and market competition. And we'll come up with a minimal acceptable result. And this is great. If you have this column, it will help you get to a point where when you have to make a no decision, you're able to say, okay, we didn't meet this minimum result. It's another issue with drug developers. Sometimes we'll just keep going even when something's not going to work. So at least this will help you. If you have a pipeline, it will help you say, okay, we have to stop here. We have to move on to the next one or look at a different indication. Then we have the ideal result, which is what we're really looking for the best success. If we have these down here, it will really help the team focus. So we include in here the primary product indication. You might not actually know it at the start of development. You may know, for example, our proof of concept indicates this product could be really effective in oncology or osteoporosis, but we're not really sure what the exact indication will be. So it may be broad, and only later in development will you come in and add more detail here. Patient population, will you be administering to very sick elderly patients, or could it potentially be young children? Are they going to be in their teens, or is it neonates? It's also very relevant. If you capture this in a TPP, I'll give you an example of when this went wrong. I was once in a formulation development team for a large pharma, and we developed a great formulation. It was brilliant. Made the product really stable, but we didn't know it was meant for children. And we had used excipients that shouldn't be used in children and need specific limits in them. And if you don't share that information with your stakeholders, they're not going to know. So that's a really key point. On that same point, that same example, actually, this TPP also includes route of administration, the delivery mode. So back to this formulation we developed, it was really stable, but it was actually for an intracranial administration. So we had added a lot of excipients that if you're looking at an intracranial mode of delivery, then you really don't want to be including all of those excessive excipients. You really want to minimize it. This is important information to have in a TPP. The ideal and the minimum acceptable treatment durations, really important to have defined up front. Not defined, not locked, but at least you know your ballpark and your minimum acceptable limits. your dosage form. Like, for example, if you're competitive and the only way to be competitive is to have your product in an auto-injector, then really this is something you need to be looking at early on. Dosage strength, the minimum acceptable strength, if you know that, the type of container closure, back to the auto-injector, storage conditions, and the minimum acceptable information on shelf life. For example, some drugs the standard statement is if they're not stable for at least 2 years, then that's not commercially viable. So it's a good discussion to have with your subject matter experts and your development teams, your business development teams. Typical dosage regimen, the minimum efficacy, and this depends on the type of product. Depending on the type of product, it would be a much higher or a lower number, and also depending on the risk benefit. We have the risks and side effects that would be acceptable for this kind of product, and the therapeutic modality. So this is what we would usually have in a TPP. It's as simple as a table like this, with to be determined where we have it, with some concepts in it initially, aiming to lock it down as we move through development. Then our TPP we've added to our TPP template a section for project milestones. And I think this is really handy, especially if this is a document you're sharing with your stakeholders, because then everyone knows straight away, okay, this team, this is their product, this is their TPP, they are planning on having a pre-IND meeting with the FDA in Q2 2024 and to file their IND shortly after that. Or they're going to both the FDA and the EMA or an EU national. I mean, this is information that you may not have locked, you might not have agreed, in which case you can put TBD. If you know it and you have it in this document, then it makes sure everyone's working to the same timelines and targets. So that's a summary of the TPP. If we go to the next slide, Stu. Now, looking at the importance of having a well-defined regulatory strategy. Now, if you have this, it will help guide you as you move forward, and you'll update it as you go, so it would be a living document. It's important to consider it, and there's some key points to bear in mind when putting these together. So when we're looking at our TPP, and it's quite important when we're looking at legal basis for us to also understand who will be doing the review. So in the FDA, will it be the Centre for Biologics or the Centre for Drugs or Devices? Who's going to be doing the review? That will help us focus, because we know which of these centres will focus on which topics. And they have different requirements. Then we need to know whether our product is a combination or not. So is it a combination of drugs? Is it a combination of a drug and a biologic, or a drug and device? Because as soon as we get into combinations, we can involve multiple of these offices. And the level of innovation based on precedent at the commercial or development stage, particularly from a manufacturing, production, CMC perspective, this is quite important, because innovative products will get additional support and attention. They'll also get support, is true, they'll get a lot of support, but they will get additional attention, and that's not always the type of attention you want. There'll probably be a lot more focus on safety for the beginning of those types of innovative programs. Planned indications will be quite important, and they'll help us understand how to manage those regulatory interactions. So for example, if we know that our indication is going to be an orphan indication, it's a rare disease, then that will help us know that we can get some incentives. We can file for an orphan drug designation. We can have more interactions. So this is one to consider. And to look into that, you want to understand the level of prevalence of your disease. And that will help you understand if you can classify as a rare disease that will qualify for this orphan drug status. And the level of non-clinical data. So that's the pharmacology and tox data that we need. If we understand how much of this we have, based on the indication that we're going for, will help us understand the level of information we have to feed into our clinical trial designs. It will help us select our purity limits and our dosing for our first study. We need an understanding of the available rules and guidelines from the FDA on any of the identified particulars. There's thousands of guidance documents out there, and sometimes they're not all in the same place, they're scattered around. So in addition to all of these guidance documents and the regulations that are in place, There's industry standard as well, so we need to be applying those too. But what I would say, to keep it as simple as we can, always start with the end product in mind, start with your TPP, and then work backwards and build a regulatory strategy. And it doesn't have to be locked. Like I said, it would move, but the likelihood is you have some stakeholders, perhaps they'll be investing, and for them to be able to see that you have a TPP and an initial regulatory strategy and a drug development plan, that will really help you move forward. We go to our next slide, Stuart. So when in the process should we approach the FDA? Based on the conclusions from a regulatory assessment of the technology that we're going to be using, the optimum timing for the interactions with the FDA, if we can get this right, we'll have a streamlined regulatory process and a procedure. Now, the current FDA procedures make it difficult to have informal interactions with the FDA. We can't call them up and have a conversation or send them an email if it's not part of the standard procedure, if it's just admin related. But we do have some options. There's recently added formal meetings that allow for different interactions at different times of development. But for each of these, there's a lot of effort that goes into them, and we want to make sure that those meetings are effective. We've got something really quite innovative that we can get in those early interactions, like the Interact, before we've even really generated some real solid data. If we've got new chemical entities, these require some non-clinical information to have discussions. So you can request meetings and they can be rejected. So in those cases, depending on the type of products you have, you want to make sure you have some data where the agency thinks you're in a suitable position to have a discussion with them because you have a viable program. So in some cases, you want to have at least perhaps a pilot batch where you've demonstrated you've got some material that you can make, you can follow, you're ready to be following CGMPs for your clinical material, and that you've got proof of concept. If new products that are already established classes, these might only require interaction of a clinical nature. You might not need to talk about every topic. So we've got non-clinical, chemistry, manufacturing control, CMC, and clinical, and regulatory. These are the topics we typically talk to the agency about. You may not need to talk to all of them, and you might just want to focus on your clinical. Generally there's a platform approach and there's lots of data required. For example, with monoclonal antibodies, lots of experience in manufacturing of those. If you're following a standard process, you might not want to have any CMC dialogue. You might want to go straight into clinical dialogue. Depending on the nature of the product, it is important to discuss with the FDA on your clinical program design. You may have a study where you're required to start in healthy volunteers, or perhaps that wouldn't be ethical and you'd have to go straight into a patient population to ensure an appropriate risk benefit. And the timing for these interactions can really vary. So if you have an innovative product, it's really quite useful to have that interaction early on, just like in our initial flow chart. If you are developing a program, you are generally following the guidelines with a few exceptions, then having a pre-IND interaction should be sufficient just before you have your IND. When I say just before, you want to have that interaction so you have time to implement the agency's feedback. So perhaps 3, maybe 6 months before you're planning on filing your IND, have that meeting, have that discussion. It's always a balance between having the discussion early enough so you can address the comments, but also having the discussion at a point where you have enough data. So about 3 months before is something we commonly do with small to medium enterprises. It's also useful to plan this in advance from a global perspective. Perhaps you're having interactions with the FDA, but you're also interested in the EU, or that's an area you want to go to too. So you don't want to duplicate any efforts. So you can harmonize a lot of the questions you're asking, and even the packages that you're putting forward. There's a lot of information that you can harmonize when you go to see various agencies. So that's something you can also do. It is important to have those interactions, but sometimes it might not be necessary, and we can cover that in one of the next slides. So if we go to the next slide, Stu. Okay, so I hand over to Dan. Dan's going to go through with us what are the options, meeting types that the FDA offers.
Well, thank you, Zed. That was excellent. I think what I wanted to get here is to get a little bit more detail on the type of meetings that you can have. As you saw from the previous presentation, there are different times and different type of meetings. FDA has put together not only the meetings, but also the type of designations that also help in acceleration of development and in additional supports that they do. So depending on the nature of the product and depending on the nature of the indications that you're going to develop the product for, you can have different type of meetings. I think just as a summary, I think early in development, the type of meetings that you have, as Zed mentioned, were most likely an interact meeting or a pre-IND meeting if you're doing early development and you want to get into the clinical. But the meeting types are different, and I'll talk also about the timing on when, how long does it take to have those meetings. But they have set up meetings with the letters type A meeting. These are not very common meetings. The type A meeting is a meeting when you already are into a clinical program and you have, or it could be preclinical, but you have stalled development. Basically, that means that you're progressing and something happened and you need to have a quick discussion with FDA. Or an important safety issue. Something comes up in a clinical trial. Or FDA tells you that you need to do something and you don't necessarily agree with that. You have interacted with FDA, you went back and forth, and now you need to resolve that. Then you can call a type A meeting. Clinical holds is something that when you have safety issues or FDA doesn't clear an IND, that means that you cannot do any clinical studies or that you have very severe limitations on how to do it. So you may want to have an additional discussion with FDA and see what you need to do to move it forward. Refusal to file is more on the NDA stage or the BLA stage when you submit the file and FDA basically says you don't have sufficient information for whatever it is. Usually those are the things you discuss in a pre-NDA meeting, but sometimes companies submit something that is not fully vetted or they don't have all the information and FDA does not accept the file, then you can ask for a type A meeting to discuss what is it and specifically what they need. I think the most common meetings at specific stages are the type B meetings, and there are two types. There used to be only one type, and now they call it type B and type B end of phase meetings. And the type B meeting is, as we were talking about, is the pre-IND meeting. That's before you start your clinical program, and then the pre-NDA or pre-BLA, which is basically when you end your program, your phase 3s, and you're ready to submit for approval. Sometimes maybe you are familiar with some of the things that you heard during the pandemic was emergency use authorization meetings. Those are special cases. It's not very common that you will have emergency use authorization products. It's usually more for medical countermeasures in cases of attacks or a pandemic as it happened, where you do not have all of the information that is needed, but you have sufficient information that the risk of putting this product on an emergency basis on the market outweighs the risks. So you think that, or the other way around, you know, the benefits outweigh the risks of putting it on the market because of the emergency situation. The other type B meetings that you have is when we were talking about designations, these are designations that accelerate the development. So FDA has more flexibility on the type of resources they can put. So they can grant you, they basically, technically, they cannot refuse a meeting if you already have a breakthrough or RMAT designations. That means that they have a commitment to work with the company to make sure that they address the development needs. And then the standard end of phase meetings are basically at the end of phase 1. It's not very common at the end of phase 1 because usually these meetings will turn into what is it going to be needed for approval. So you do those generally after the end of phase 2 to design your phase 3 program, or at the end of phase 3 when you have the data and you need to discuss what you're going to submit in the application. Then there's another meeting which they used to have is the Type C meeting. They still have it, but it used to be up to the Type C meeting, and basically it was everything else. Everything else that you want to talk about from a development perspective, it can be prior to the IND, it can be after the IND. It is just a general consultation that is not tied to any of the other specific ones. However, one of the things that they discovered is that the Type C meetings tended to be long, and they were getting very, sometimes you had a simple question and you really didn't need to have a whole Type C meeting with multiple disciplines and everything. So they created the Type D meeting as something that is very focused, a very narrow set of issues, and is usually with a single discipline. If you have a question on a simple question on a clinical trial that you want to run, or that you're running, and this question is pretty simple, or 1 or 2 questions on that, then they created this Type D meeting to address those issues. Sometimes, usually after the other meetings, you had a clarification question, and you didn't want to wait 3 or 4 months before you can talk to FDA. And because they do not like, as Zed mentioned at the beginning, the days of just picking up the phone and calling FDA are gone. Those they have to be more rigorous on the way that they approach things. So they created this also as an avenue to ask clarification questions after the meeting. And they interact, which I think Zed clearly explained what it is very early in development. They also created this a few years ago. It started in the biologics area, because most of the innovation during those days was new biologic approaches, gene therapies, different approaches. And now they have expanded that to incorporate it into drug products, because there are innovative drug products that will require this kind of early interaction. So that's basically the whole scope of all the type of interactions that you can have. There are still some divisions where you can still, for example, myself as an agent, when I'm representing a company, there's a good communication between the project managers at the level of the different divisions, and they communicate and they try to facilitate and they try to be helpful. But usually, if it requires more time, they will tend to come back to you and say, well, for this type of discussion, you need to call a Type C meeting or a Type D meeting. But sometimes you can get some information still, but not as it used to be a few years ago. Next slide. So on the timelines, this is they're very strict. These are mandated by Congress, and so they have certain goals that they need to meet when you request a meeting. And here it gives you kind of the matrix of the different things that the different timelines for the different meetings. The key point is that basically the meeting dates and the request date. That's basically you request a meeting for a Type A meeting, and that's the fastest meeting they can give, which is within 30 days. And then different type of meetings have different timelines. And in some cases, for certain meetings, you need to submit the entire meeting package, not only the meeting request, but you need to submit the entire meeting package. And then for other meetings, you have some time after they grant the meeting to submit your meeting package. What we usually recommend, and we work with clients to make sure that the meeting package, regardless of the meeting, if it needs to be final, of course, you don't have any flexibility there. But if it doesn't need to be final, you want to make sure that your meeting requests go in when you already have a very good sense of what the meeting package is going to look like. You have a first or second draft already, because the last thing you want to do is be granted a meeting date by FDA, and then for whatever reason you miss your submission date for the meeting package, and if you submit it late, FDA may cancel the meeting. So you want to really avoid that. That's what we highly recommend, to have a good sense of what your meeting package is going to look like for a Type C meeting or a Type B meeting, for example. I think that covers all of them. The other one that the other point that I wanted to make here is that there's a new way of FDA is offering. They still call it a meeting, but it is really written responses. In many cases, what they say is we grant the meeting as a written response only. That means that there's no interaction. They looked at your package, they looked at your meeting request, and they say these type of questions, we can answer them. And then we think that we should be able to answer all your questions. And then if you have other things that you need to discuss, then you can, for example, have a type D meeting on that. The type of meetings that you can have are sometimes they're telephone conference, so although most of the meetings right now are more like video conference meetings, they call it virtual face-to-face. They used to give a lot of face-to-face meetings, and that's a whole planning that you need to do in order to go to Washington, D.C., to Silver Spring, where FDA is, and it requires a lot of planning. After the pandemic, they basically canceled all the face-to-face meetings. This year, they started again giving some face-to-face meetings, but they're really they have found that the video conference meetings are very effective, and with the new technologies on video conferencing like this one, Zoom meetings, it has improved a lot. So most of the when they grant the meeting, most of the time is video conference. So if we go to the next slide. So what are the general items that you want to put in a data package when submitting the request? And we focus here in the request because depending on the meeting, you need to put a lot of background information. You gotta have a lot of information that needs to go into a meeting package. But to start the meeting, there are certain key items that you need to incorporate into the meeting request. And every IND, for example, will require to have some type of IND application number that you need, that either they assign when you submit it or they pre-assign, and you can request that in advance. And you need to identify some of the key particulars of the product. So they can, basically a meeting request is a document that allows the project manager and the key people within the divisions to see who should attend the meeting. What are the key experts that you want in that meeting? You can also request the type of people that you would like to have in a meeting. If you want to have a statistical review, then you might want to make sure the people from the division of the statistics group is there, or a pharmacology, if you want a pharm tox expert on that, or of course CMC. You need to identify the type of meeting that you need to have and what are the type of questions you want to have. You usually request the type of meeting you want. However, it's up to FDA to decide whether they grant you the meeting that you ask or they change it. We have many times we submitted one type of meeting and they said, well, this is not a type D meeting, but we grant you a type C meeting. So slightly different on the timelines, but then they change it. Many times companies ask for the type A meeting because they want to have something fast. And as I said, only under very specific circumstances, they will grant you a type A. But then they say, okay, not a type A, but a type B or a type C. So those are the type of things that they will review when you see your meeting request. Pediatrics, you need to identify whether you're going to be doing pediatrics. They may need to have additional resources from other areas if you are going to be doing pediatric development. And there are many products and technologies that are available now that you can start in pediatrics only directly. So I think that has advanced quite a bit, particularly with more targeted technologies and clinical programs. Meeting format, list of questions. The list of questions is essential. I think that's where we spend quite a bit of time. It seems like a simple thing, but the way that you ask the questions, you want to make sure that you get the right answers by FDA. You're going to be very specific on what you want to know or how you would like to answer the question, so you don't get just a yes or no answer, that you get more of their assessment. And if they are not going to agree with you, then you want to ask the question in a way that at minimum they provide additional information to, so you can really know how to turn that no into a yes by putting together, by satisfying their needs, for example. And then proposed agenda, and as I said, list of attendees that you would like to have, and the list of attendees that you're going to have from your company. So that's in general what goes into a document. Next slide. Okay.
Hey.
So I think this one. Oh no, these are the okay. Let me check. Is this yours or the?
That's right, Dan.
So you take it from here.
Yep. What responses? Thank you for covering that, Dan. Great information. And I know what to plan in my package. So our next piece is what responses should we expect from the FDA? So we followed the advice Dan has given, and we have submitted a meeting request. Well, the first interaction is confirmation of the type of meeting that the agency will accept. So we will typically receive notification, meeting is accepted, and they will tell us whether it will be a meeting where we actually have a dialogue and a discussion, usually a telecon, or if it will be written. And this one's the most common at the moment. Since the pandemic, in fact, we've seen a real shift. We'll get written advice only. But what we can also have is, and it does happen quite often, depending on the type of meeting we put forward, they will come back and they can say, they can deny it. So the one where I've seen it happen quite a bit has been for the interact meetings. So you really have to be in an early stage of development to get one of those. And we do have the agency come back and say, actually, do you know what? You are more suited to filing a pre-IND meeting request rather than qualifying for an interact meeting. So they will respond and they will tell you, this isn't suitable for you, or do this, or they'll say, we expect this level of data for you to have this kind of meeting. So you will have, that will be our first interaction with the agency. Depending on the kind of meeting, what they've agreed to, the next one will be, they'll give us, most likely they'll give us written responses only. And in some cases, we'll be invited for that team discussion. If we do have that meeting with the agency, they will send us some preliminary comments. And we usually plan to receive those a few days before the meeting, and this will allow for some preparation. I will say there have been some occasions we've received it on the day of the meeting. That's been rare and far between, but it has happened. But it's very useful because they will answer the straightforward questions immediately, so you don't really need to discuss those. But there may be some that are contentious and need a bit of discussion, so it will allow you to make the most of that meeting. Once you've had that meeting, or you've received just the written responses, this should be reviewed very carefully, because you have this window where you can go back to the agency and request clarification. You can't really throw in a brand new question and say, oh, while we're here, let's ask about this, because they'll tell you to request that question in a new procedure. But if it's a question or a comment they've given you that really isn't clear, we don't understand the answer to our question, then we can go back and say, you've asked for this, we're not sure what you mean. Do you mean this? Will this satisfy your question? Because it's not clear for us what will. And to this one, they can, depending on the type of question and the program manager you have on their side, they can respond by email, or they might well indicate a separate meeting is required. And the response window could be within a few days to within a few weeks. The thing to note about the FDA, when we get our responses, unlike some of the other agencies that perhaps could be considered more polite, but might be beating around the bush a bit, the FDA won't do that. They will very clearly say, we agree, or we do not agree. So it'll be very clear. And they will explain their rationale. So they'll say, we do not agree with your approach because of X, Y, and Z. The slightly vague bit might be when they say the final decision will be a matter of review. But this more or less means that either you didn't give enough data to them to make an assessment, in which case they will say that we didn't have enough data to make an assessment, or it's because they need to see everything in context. So they will say the final decision will be a matter of review. So if they've given you some advice, for example, they'll say this specification should be tightened, but the final decision will be a matter of review. That really says you can tighten it, but if you don't want to, and you put scientific rationale, you've got some flexibility because it's a matter of review. So they will review it in context. So it usually indicates some flexibility. Our policy is ask a good question, get a good answer. If you ask a very broad question, you'll get a very broad answer. So if you say something like, is our development program acceptable? They will say, follow the development guidances. They'll give you a very general response. If you're very specific about your question, you know, do you find our clinical synopsis is adequate to support this study and this study purpose, in particular X, Y, and Z? They will give you a specific answer, answering in particular X, Y, and Z responses as well. So ask a good question, get a good answer, and provide the supporting data. Sometimes we have very good questions, but we just don't have enough data in the package for the agency to make a good assessment. So that is what we should expect. We go to the next slide. What are the typical flags identified during a due diligence or gap analysis? So we have lots of programs, either investors themselves or people preparing for a review, or just people who want to know if they've got any gaps in their programs. And they ask us to perform the due diligence and gap analysis. And if we look at this, we've highlighted some of the key items that come up. That could well be clinical hold issues if you were to file your IND. And it's especially if we're focusing on early on. So these are some of the typical red flags that come up early on in a program. The first one I think is quite important. I kind of alluded to it earlier on, is what are the reasons for your interaction? Why are you having this meeting with the agencies? If you answer this one up front, it will help you develop your questions, your briefing document, and your whole strategy for that meeting. For example, we may have an interaction with the agency, but the real reason for doing it isn't because you have any real questions. You may have a very standard program and you are following all the guidance. You really don't need that interaction, but you're doing it for stakeholders and investors. For example, they want to know that you've had some kind of interaction with the agency and that the agency have had eyes on what you're doing. And in that case, you would actually modify your questions slightly. Rather than asking questions that will help you move forward in development, you're going to ask questions usually that you want to have a good document to hand to your investors. So you want to go in there and ask questions that you pretty much know the answers to. Are our specifications adequate? Are our controls appropriate? Do you agree with this part of our program? Do you agree with the design of our study? Do you agree our clinical package is adequate? No, and you know that full well and good. And your investors just want to see a document to say the FDA have agreed. So if you know up front, you can design your questions and briefing document differently. Otherwise, if that's not a major issue and you really do have some issues and you want to get some buy-in, in fact, one of your reasons for interacting is to see if you can speed up your program. So you're going to go in quite aggressively and put some challenging ideas forward to see if you can cut the time of your program. And in those cases, be prepared to get answers that are, no, we do not agree. Because that's okay, because at least you've pushed and you've tried. So it depends on what you want to do. If you want to go with get investors, then you want to have some more yes answers. You need to push your program forward and take some new ideas forward and present them to the agencies and pitch some of this new approach. Then be prepared to get the no answers. But you'll also get yes answers among those that will help you move forward using a novel approach. So the reasons for the interaction are really quite important. And they have been red flags, because sometimes we've had feedback and actually the feedback was not the kind of feedback you'd want to present to investors. So it's really worth considering your questions. And also, do you need to go? If you don't have any particular drivers and you are using a very standard platform approach, you don't really need to go to see the agencies. So these are considerations you should have when you're working on this. For red flags, make sure that you know the main focus of the agency for your first clinical study or first in human will be safety. And this is something that they will put many trials on clinical hold for safety related items. It will be the first thing they'll look at. in CMC, non-clinical and clinical areas. They'll be focusing on those in terms of your clinical study design, your impurities for CMC, and your tox studies for non-clinical. Safety will really be a focus for them. And tying into that will be lack of sufficient information on the patient-informed consent, for example. There's an example. You're compromising that. And the lack of clear tox data to help you justify your clinical starting dose. Unsuitable or insufficient release tests. So if we look at our release testing panel, we often get pushed back on this. A lot of CMOs, contract manufacturing organizations, will want to report results on a specification. And this could be related to a number of reasons. Perhaps there's some liability with a failed batch and they don't have much experience, so they're not willing to put down tight specifications. But that doesn't often fly with agencies. They will want to see some controls, in particular around content and purity and potency, if that's applicable. If you have a purity method, put some orthogonal methods in there too. And also, we mustn't forget, if we've got a drug device combination, for example, a product in a pre-filled syringe, then we want to make sure we've got our performance related tests. That's one that's often missed entirely, and then we're asked for it as part of clinical hold. But to set those methods up, get them running at a lab and have them confirmed as fit for purpose can take months. So it's a real issue. So we want to make sure we have these right. Other problems include the impurity clearance justifications. So this is again taking us back to safety. If our specifications are too wide, if we are using some components in our manufacturing process, perhaps antibiotics, some kind of selection agent, methotrexate, some other in-process material we're using that has some potential toxicity, and we're not able to justify its clearance, this could be a problem. If we have impurity on the specs, if our specifications are too wide, quite recently we had a product put on clinical hold. It was a recombinant protein with an impurity limit of greater than 10%, almost 20%, and it was inappropriate. So we were pushed back, and we had to go back and tighten the process and tighten the spec to less than 10%. It depends on the program. This is an example for you. The other thing the agency will look at and comment on usually quite quickly are on any unexplained differences between the clinical batch and the batch that was used in the tox studies for non-clinical. Those are usually, the clinical batch is usually the cGMP batch that you're using in the clinic, and the tox batch is typically the pilot batch that was preceding that GMP batch. It's usually dirtier, which is fine. If it's dirtier than the clinical batch, that's usually okay because you can justify a larger level of impurities. But the downside is if it's actually cleaner than the clinical batch has higher level of impurities, that's a problem. Or if the clinical batch has any new impurities, these really point to safety. If there are impurities we can't justify, we might need to repeat the tox study. So that's something we really need to make sure we explain in our IND, any differences between the tox and clinical batches and why they're there, and that we understand them, we've characterized them, and that they don't impact safety. We may also be put on hold if we file without enough stability data. We want enough data in there to show them that we understand that our product stability profile, and that we envisage we'll have enough data to support the stability of the product for the duration of the study. We usually would have a tox batch which is manufactured before the clinical batch, and that gives us our supporting data for stability. We usually have that preceding the GMP batch by a few months, and it allows us to look forward. If there are insufficient data for that batch or the GMP batch, so if we've only got 2 batches because we're a small developer, then we want to make sure we have at least 1 month of data on our clinical GMP batch, in addition to the batch preceding that supports our shelf life assignment. The other thing that we've had come up that has resulted in a clinical hold is we have had a product that required a complex process prior to administration. The product had to be reconstituted, then diluted, and then put into a specific type of infusion bag and administered using a certain type of infusion tubing at a specified flow rate. And when we filed the IND, we didn't include this information. So that's a real issue. We need to make sure we include an assessment of the product compatibility and stability with all of the components that touch the product prior to administration. When you have a complex administration like that, for example, you may have some products that will stick to different types of infusion bags or infusion tubing. It may affect protein content, or you may have issues with particulates for different types of product container contact materials. So it's really important to have an in-use compatibility study in your IND when you've got this kind of administration process, or you would be put on clinical hold. And then the other red flag is if you have unjustified deviations. There is standard practice and guidance, and as soon as we move away from that, we're doing something different from that, we need to justify it. So we need to go in and explain, for example, if we're not following standard ICH guidance on our stability program, we need to say why we're not following those standard time points and why our approach will still give us the confidence that we can understand the stability profile of the product and that the product was stable over its shelf life or the clinical trial period. These are a few red flags that we've identified and we wanted to share with the team. We can now go to the next slide. So these were some of the key points we wanted to share with you all on interactions with the agencies, the procedures, the timelines, and the type of issues that would come up during the process. And the key takeaways for us are we've got to plan development, our drug development strategy early, and incorporate our regulatory strategy with that to make sure we have the most streamlined path to getting into the clinic and then through development and to approval. As part of that, we want to identify those key interactions with the FDA and ensure that all of those requirements are addressed up front, and it will help us avoid any duplication of testing or delays later on. I like this famous phrase here that we have from Dan, is there is never enough time to do it right, but there is always time to do it over. And this is a really sad situation. We do see it time and time and again, where at the start there's so much pressure on a team that they're not able to take the advice that they're given, and they just move forward. And unfortunately, when it doesn't go right, they have time to just do it all over again. So let's avoid that situation, knowing that our interactions with the agencies can often involve in commitments that we have in writing now that we have to always justify if we don't follow them. We can find agency can be unforgiving at times, and development is complicated. Development is complicated and time consuming. So getting that early input is the best advice you can take. I would say that seek that guidance, seek the guidance from the agencies, seek the guidance from professionals. We're here for you. And now we move on to our Q&A session. So Stuart, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Zeb. And we've got just a few moments here now for a few questions. So I can see that a couple of people have raised their hands in the to speak, but I would urge, if possible at this time, just to put any questions in or any additional questions in the questions and answers box. So we've had a couple of calls come through. Thank you for your contributions, Dan and Zeb. That was great. So just looking at a couple of the questions here, you mentioned earlier about your global plan and your EU strategy. How do we align the FDA regulatory strategy with the global plan?
That is a great question. Thank you for whoever posted that. They do align quite well. We presented a pathway in this deck for the FDA. We have a similar one for the EU, and there's a lot of points and designations you can actually harmonize. There's some that are very different. So very different, for example, the orphan drug designation. In the EU and the US, it's very different, very different requirements. It's much harder to get orphan drug designation in the EU, and the package is much bulkier. So if you did have an orphan product and you were focusing on the US, I would say get the EU for the US ODD first, and then as you build that data, you can subsequently, with a bigger package, apply for the EU ODD. but there's the harmonization can happen with the agency interaction. So if you're going for a pre-IND meeting with the FDA, you could also at the same time go for meetings with EU nationals. If it's very early development, you don't really want a meeting at that point with the EMA. It's much more costly, and the EMA will not approve your clinical trial. So ideally, you want to meet with the regulator in the region in the EU that will approve your clinical trial. For example, if you're doing your trial in Norway and Germany and France, those are regions that you would directly go to and have an interaction with them. And even meeting with 3 of them will be less costly than going to the EMA. So we would advise that you'd meet perhaps with the sites where you think your trial is going to go ahead, even if it's 3, and the FDA, and you would use essentially the same briefing package. There are some differences that the EU assessors are used to and that the US assessors are used to. So we'd make some tweaks just to make it easier for them to review what we're doing. We do think that the agencies have had a lot of turnover. So we've changed our style in writing briefing documents to almost add more detail and to illustrate that we are really expert in what we're talking about, and the advice we're giving and the requests we're giving are coming from a place of knowledge, and we think our justifications are strong. So we're modifying our briefing documents a bit, and we think that's related to perhaps additional training or some inexperience in some of the assessors, certainly not all of them. But that's a quick answer to your question about harmonizing how we deal with our EU and US strategies. Good question.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, following on, can we give an example of a challenging meeting that we've had with the FDA?
I have an example. Dan, do you want to go first?
Oh, you go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. We have lots of meetings with the FDA, as I mentioned. I mean, as a company, we must meet with them many times. The ones I've been involved in is at least 2 or 3 a month. There was a challenging meeting I had and it was because our program was on hold. I think that would be type C, right, Dan? And it was, I remember now, it was a refuse to file for an NDA. So we had to go in. I mean, this is a big deal. Refuse to file would be, they wouldn't accept our filing. So we had to go in, and we went in with a team from Korea, Japan, and US and UK. So we had English, Korean, and Japanese speakers, and we had different language translators. We had questions from the agency, and the agency were really not happy with our approach to process validation. We had a slightly complex program, and we wanted a file without a process validation package. And so we had to go in, and even in the pre-comments we had, and these were the ones we received on the day rather than a few days before, the day of the meeting, they agreed with some of the other points, but this one was a refuse to file issue. They were insisting on having this data. So we had to go in there and say, look, we've got really strong process characterization. You have to allow us to go in and do this post-approval, and argue the fact that it was a small molecule essentially, and that it did qualify for this, and that the differences they were worried about, we would make sure they were covered in our process characterization package. So it was a real difficult conversation, and there was some tension, but by the end we did get through that, and we managed to get agreement with them, and that product is now approved.
Thanks, Ed. Another question here. Can we give an example of how the meetings are run? Who would lead the meeting?
I can take that. Yeah, I think one of the things is that you always have to remember that the way that it is set up with FDA, the meetings are the sponsor meetings. So it is really to some extent up to the company how you want to run the meeting. The FDA will definitely put certain rules. They will tell you how do they want the meeting to be run, how do you need to speak, in a way of saying, we're gonna talk about these things because you sent an agenda, and then you run the meeting basically, and then you if you had your preliminary comments from FDA and you told them what you wanted to discuss, you drive the agenda, you can submit, for example, 7 questions, but you only want to talk about questions 3, 5, and 6, and you want to start with question 6. You start with question 6. So the company decides how you want to run the meeting and what is most important to get an answer. The one thing that is important to know is that if the FDA gives you a 1-hour meeting, when the 1 hour comes, people, when I have face-to-face meetings, people will just get up and leave. They do not spend a single minute after the meeting. The same thing with the video conference. The project manager will interrupt and say, this is the end of the meeting. So you always try to run the meeting in a way that you put your top priority answers or clarifications that you need based on their preliminary responses first. But it is up to the company. It's very interactive. FDA is very good. And then you need to identify basically what you're representing and who's going to talk. Usually the regulatory person is the person leading the meeting or coordinating the meeting. So you're kind of the MC if you're the regulatory point person, because they want to have one point person on their side. It could be the project manager, but most likely it's either the team leader that runs the meeting, or sometimes is the director of the division that runs the meeting from their side, and then they kind of ask the different people to answer questions that you may have. But I think it's important to know that it is your meeting, it is the sponsor's meeting, and so you have a lot of say on how you run those meetings.
Thanks, Dan. And again, as the team mentioned earlier, always seek advice and support if required and you're not sure. We're often happy to help prepare for these types of interactions. Okay, next question. Are there any potential downsides or risks to having an early interaction with the FDA?
I can try that,
yeah,
and maybe
please, Dan.
you also had a lot of meetings. I think that the downside is if you do not have sufficient data. This is a balance. I mean, if we talk about innovative technologies, I think it's good to have early meetings, because you don't want to be spending a lot of time doing a lot of work and then FDA saying, well, this is not what we really like. I think when we talk about general development, a new monoclonal antibody for rheumatoid arthritis, okay, there's many of those that have been done. So I think you want to generate some data, but you don't want to go without any data either. So you run the risk if you go too early, that FDA may say, well, you don't have any information that we can really give you a proper answer. And I think we try to address that during the presentation, is there has to be a balance there. You need to know what can you ask and what do you need input in. But from a real risk, I don't see major risks in having early discussions with FDA. If anything, you may not get the answers that you want, but I always found that it is of more benefit to interact with FDA than it is not. So most of the major concerns that happen during development are because you didn't have a good interaction with FDA or any regulatory agency, is to that effect. And Seb, I don't know if you want to expand on that or you agree.
I agree, Dan. I think you're right. Most of the time, it's better to have that interaction. The only downside I can think of is where you've interacted so early that you've committed to something and you shouldn't have. Because as soon as you've committed to it, it's in writing, and that will follow you. So you'll have to justify why you haven't followed that. And it just increases the burden on you. But as long as you don't make a solid commitment, and I agree with Dan, it's better to have that interaction. In fact, most of the time when we do have an issue or on clinical hold, the question is, why didn't we have that interaction? So I think it's good.
So we use a lot we'll take it under advisement instead of committing. If FDA says we recommend such and such, then we take it under advisement. Is our standard response.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tabs. Okay, another great question here. Can we speak of any specific challenges or considerations for a cell therapy product?
That is a great question. So when it comes to cell therapy products, they have a whole bag of special considerations from a reg point of view. Some of the issues that the agency will flag looking at an IND, or even in your pre-IND interaction, will be some of the obvious ones are your designation for drug substance. So you may have a cell therapy, perhaps it's autologous continuous manufacturing process. They will still want to see a designation for a clear drug substance and a drug product for regulatory purposes. So that's one. Another issue, the big issue with these programs is the potency test method. And we might not even understand potency and the mechanism of action at this stage. So it will be really to try and understand what indicators we have to support potency. And you work quite closely with a non-clinical team actually on the answer to that one and the mechanism of action. And then we have anything that's used in the secret sauce. For example, if it's an allogeneic product and cells are modified, activated, and there's some specific bespoke cytokine or some other molecule that's added to the secret sauce to induce or initiate a change of some kind. If that's bespoke, then the agencies will really focus on that. They want to make sure that it's safe. They want to make sure that there's some controls and that we understand the stability. If there's any vectors used, perhaps you've got some viral vectors used to modify that, like with a CAR T, then they're really going to want to understand the history of that. So we've had people come to see us with a program that they thought was quite solid, but they just didn't have the history of how their vector seed bank was set up. And these are big holes. So we need to make sure those are filled. So it's making sure you've got all that historical data and you're following the trail of storage and control for these. Any other big issues? I think the designation and the specifications around potency and strength, they're ones we'd have to look at quite early on. And of course, shipment and product stability. I could go on all day, but I think those are the main ones for a cell therapy. Good question. Thank you.
Thank you. Couple of questions. We've just got enough time. So again, if there's any last questions that you'd like to ask, we can address them. But great question here. How would we go about setting up our own regulatory strategy?
Okay.
Well,
go for it.
Go ahead.
Okay. So we would, if you're starting out, I think always start with a target product profile. If that's something you can start with, using the example we provided, something like that, an easy single document, if you can get everyone on the same page, you know where you want to go. There's going to be parts of that you perhaps don't know, and you don't maybe understand, like the legal basis and the division. I would get some support here, get some support from some reg professionals, shameless pitch like Scendea, but some reg expert to come in and give you some input on that legal basis and to help you understand which divisions and what category your product would fall under. And then to build that strategy, the regulatory strategy, you also want to do it hand in hand with the drug development strategy, because they are combined and they happen together, drug development and the regulatory program. You would then look perhaps at the flow chart we showed earlier, and you try and see which of those designations at the bottom of your product will qualify. You'd build a top level timeline for those in. And then you'd map out a regulatory pathway, and that would be in combination with your clinical team. For example, that was just an example that we showed, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Perhaps you've got an orphan and you're only going to use a single well-designed study. Perhaps you've got a biosimilar where that standard approach doesn't apply, and you'll do an initial PK study and perhaps an efficacy study, if that. So it depends on the type of program. So you'll combine your clinical folks, your regulatory folks, your non-clinical team, because they'll tell you about the packages they'll need for each of these trials, and then finally approval. And your CMC team who will work on the supply to feed these trials and demonstrate the manufacturing process is robust. So you want a multidisciplinary team working on a drug development plan and a reg strat together, the basis of which are nicely illustrated at the start of the deck. So you start with a TPP and then just work through your designations and the regulatory steps. I think that's a good way to start.
Thanks, Zeb. A quick question here. How many people should we be inviting to a FDA meeting?
Okay,
Dan, perhaps you'd like to say this one.
I can take that. I think it depends, of course, the type of questions that you ask. Usually, from a pure regulatory representation, you always want to have one person from regulatory to coordinate or to run the meeting, but you also want to have somebody with a regulatory background that can take good notes. You are not allowed by FDA to record the meetings. So it is you cannot do that. So you need to have somebody with a regulatory mindset that is recording the meeting. There are certain things that FDA will say that means something for regulatory, but it may not mean something for a technical expert, and because it's not scientific in sense, it is more regulatory. So you need to have that level at the regulatory level. And then from each discipline, you usually have one or two people. It is better to have two people. So if you're talking about 3 different areas, I would say it's about 7 to 10 people at a meeting. You don't want to have a lot of people at a meeting, particularly on face-to-face meetings. On the phone, FDA is flexible about if more people need to be on a phone or in a conference room. So it's not that there's a rigid rule or anything. But I think to be effective, usually a couple of people from each discipline and good regulatory representation. Hope that that answers that question.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Zeb. Some great comments there. We did have a couple of questions with regards to devices, and obviously, just to be clear, and sorry for not being clearer earlier on, the support that we can comment on would be for medicinal therapeutic products. But please feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to point you in the right direction for a regulatory group for devices or diagnostics. So apologies that we can't address those comments there. We've got just a few moments left of the call. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of those who attended the call today. Thank you, Dan and Zeb, for your contribution to this webinar. Please feel free to reach out to me or any of my colleagues here at Scendea should you have any further questions or you'd like to arrange a focused conversation with regards to your own particular projects and programs. We'd be more than happy to have those conversations. We will circulate a follow-up email, and we do have a questionnaire coming out shortly after this session that we would just politely request that you take the time just to fill out. There's a few short questions, and we'd be most grateful. But unless there's any further questions, I'd like to thank everyone again, and we hope to speak to you in the future. And we wish each and every one of you the very best of luck with your development and hopeful regulatory interactions with the FDA and other agencies in the future. Thanks a lot.